Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got another great show for you today. It is Thursday, I believe, and Niall is back with us.
I am glad to be back with you, Robby, and it's been a busy week all around, but again, a lot to talk about.
Yes, indeed.
So let's kick us off there. What is on your radar?
Well, the Democratic Party, as viewers well know, is in utter shambles, to borrow a phrase from Elrond of The Lord of the Rings, a reference I have come to understand Niall does not appreciate. The Democratic Party is scattered, divided, and leaderless. Is there one who could unite them? Sports commentator Stephen A. Smith says it's clearly not Kamala Harris. In a recent discussion with Tommy Vitor of Pod Save America, Smith assailed the Democratic Party for failing to listen to what actual voters want. He thinks that the last Democratic candidate who possessed popular legitimacy was Barack Obama. After Obama's 2 elections, Dem elites intervened to handpick the presidential candidates with predictably disastrous results. Let's listen to some of that interview.
Y'all are too busy trying to pick candidates for the American people instead of listening to the American people tell you who they want. The last Democrat that the American people told you they wanted was Barack Obama. Hillary Clinton, it's her turn. Bernie Sanders had momentum. It's Hillary's turn. Joe Biden captured momentum because Representative Clyburn got involved in South Carolina, saved his behind, but it's really his turn, okay? He has no business running for re-election, but everybody went for it, knowing he was supposed to be transitional. He's going to be 81 years of age. Then you sit up there. He doesn't have a primary. Then he goes on the debate stage, embarrasses himself. Then y'all still let him take 3 damn weeks to walk away instead of getting the hell out there immediately so you can see if there's somebody other than Kamala Harris who could be the Democratic nominee. Then she gets the nomination, and everybody wants to act like she's the rock star all of y'all wanted all along. Oh, my God, let's throw up our hands and just to say, hey, she is the one.
The Democratic Party's approach is notably different from the Republican Party's approach. Yes, various facets resisted Trump, and in fact, the party had an actual nominating process in 2024 to see if a different candidate could triumph. This failed because Republican voters want Trump, they need Trump, they demand Trump. The GOP now exists to give its supporters exactly what they want and exactly what they're voting for. You may not like what that is, but it's democracy. Here's Smith making that exact point.
Trump has been around since 2015. They had Christie, they had Kasich, they had Fiorini, I believe her name is.
Yep, Carly Fiorina.
You had, later on, you had DeSantis, you had Nikki Haley, you had Ramaswamy, you had all of these people. It didn't matter. We went through lawfare and all this stuff. It didn't matter. They looked the public in the face and they said, we want him. We don't care what y'all want, and forced the Republican Party to capitulate to the demands of their constituency. That's what they did. The Democrats somehow, some way, have gotten away with ignoring the constituency and compelling the constituency to capitulate to what they want as a party. And that is the problem. And that's why I said it all needs to go. Some of those candidates need to go. The pundits, the strategists, they need to go. Whoever was involved with the latest election, from a strategy standpoint, every one of them should be fired. Every one of them.
Now, I saw this clip going viral on social media, and Smith's remarks were heartily agreed to by just about everybody. By listening to the consultant class, the Democratic Party has made itself irrelevant. Now, maybe that's just temporary. It could certainly rebound. But so long as the party refuses to better understand its voters and then promise to do what they want, it will remain lost. The fact that Stephen A. Smith is stating this so eloquently and with so much fire is interesting. The Republican Party has obviously been well served ultimately by turning to a figure from the world of celebrity and entertainment. One really can't help but wonder whether Smith himself could have a future as a Democratic candidate. Now, he has repeatedly shot down this rumor, but the rumor is spreading that he could run for president. Now, as recently as Monday, he did say he would not run, although he added that if he thought he had a really good shot, it's something he would consider. He also said that Kamala Harris better not run. It's not clear if he'll get his wish or not. Kamala Harris reportedly signed with a talent agency, the same one that represents former President Barack Obama, this week. There's widespread media speculation that she might enter the 2026 California gubernatorial race, in which she would be the clear frontrunner, whether she plans to use that perch as a stepping stone to another presidential run remains anyone's guess. And Niall, I was reminded over the weekend that so Nixon is the vice presidential candidate or vice president under Eisenhower, runs for president in 1960, is defeated, then runs for governor of California, actually loses that race. You think that's over for him, then runs for president again and becomes president. Kamala Harris could follow that exact same trajectory.
Following in Richard Nixon's footsteps. I'm sure that's a record she would be delighted to try to avoid claiming. Even.
Unlike Richard Nixon, I suspect she would win governor of California
I think
quite
she
easily.
Would.
But
was it when Nixon lost the governorship, was that when he gave the speech? That
you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
Right, all of that.
8 years later, he was in the White House.
He was president. So look, as for Stephen A. Smith, I think he's a talented commentator, and I thought that was a good example of why he's a talented commentator, because he is right about significant numbers of things he says, and I think he also, though, blurs out a lot of the nuance or complexity more recently. So he was right that clearly the DNC put a thumb on the scales to help Hillary Clinton back in 2016 against Bernie Sanders, for example. He's right to say that Barack Obama, particularly first time around in 2008, elicited enormous excitement from not just the Democratic Party, but the liberal grassroots as a whole. The problem is when he gets into 2024, like he starts talking about, oh, they could have got rid of Biden faster than 3 weeks. I don't really know how that.
No, not without Biden's willing participation.
Exactly. And then he starts talking about how, it then fell to Kamala Harris because it was her turn. I know what he means, but like, who was going to beat her at that point?
Right.
The original sin, as it were, in that cycle was Biden running for a second term. And once that decision was made, you were kind of all the way down that track. I do also think, as far as Stephen A's comments are concerned, one of the things that I think is an understandable sort of trait when these characteristics or conversations come up is assuming that there is just a 2007, 2008 version of Barack Obama waiting somewhere in the wings to be shepherded in to save the Democratic Party. That figure doesn't exist. I mean, that's why Biden was able to run for a second term without any really serious challenger coming forward. It's why whenever that disastrous debate happened, it sort of fell to Kamala Harris and there wasn't any really, really compelling alternative. So that's the problem with Stephen A's analysis in part. Other parts of it, I think, were completely correct.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I agree with basically everything you just said. I do think some more liberal, progressive, or left-leaning people who are hostile to the Democratic Party would put more blame on the Democratic Party itself for creating that situation. I think they might, point to examples like Jerry Connolly getting it over AOC to do the oversight role. Yeah. That this is not a party that rewards or gives opportunities to fresh and new talent anyway. So maybe there is another Barack Obama out there somewhere, but it would be so hard for them to even emerge because there's just this, you got to wait in line for 50 years before the party leadership takes you seriously.
Yeah, and the congressional leadership in particular, up until very recently it was Pelosi, Clyburn, Charles Schumer is still there, of course, as the Senate Democratic leader, people who are of mature years, to say the least.
I do think it's interesting, to compare him, Stephen A. Smith, someone who is not from within inside politics. As I said, that has worked out so well for the Republican Party to look to what skills are comparable to the actual skill of running for president, of speaking to crowds, of energizing people. That's a skill set that overlaps with the kind of skill set Donald Trump had and someone like Stephen A. Smith has. I understand he's not very political, and I saw left people talking about him on Twitter like, well, what is his economic views? Does he support Medicare for all? We have no idea. That's all we care about.
Right.
So that would have to be worked out, but I don't know. I think he could do something if he decided to.
If he wants to do it, and it's not just a publicity move, he's welcome, give it a go, but obviously he will come under much more scrutiny and people will want to know such basic things as what he actually believes.
Yes, indeed. Next up, the jabs between President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy continue. We will discuss. The war of words between President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy reached new heights on Wednesday, with Trump hurling insults at the Ukrainian leader in a lengthy Truth Social post. Trump criticized Zelenskyy, writing in part, Think of it, a modestly successful comedian, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that couldn't be won, that never had to start, but a war that he, without the U.S. and Trump, will never be able to settle.
Let's remember that Russian leader Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in February 2022.
The Truth Social post continued, blasting Biden for not demanding that European countries pay an equal share in aid to Ukraine. Dictator without elections, Zelenskyy better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. In the meantime, we are successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, something I'll admit only Trump and the Trump administration can do. Trump concluded, I love Ukraine, but Zelenskyy has done a terrible job. His country is shattered. Millions have unnecessarily died, and so it continues. Now, Ukraine did postpone an election last year over the war, which is something that their constitution permits. Zelenskyy has also come under fire for banning churches and religious groups in 2024 that were accused of being tied to Russia. The main target was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which has historically been linked with Russia.
Before Trump's Truth Social post, Zelenskyy had said he respected Trump and the US, but that Trump was living in a Russian disinformation space. Trump had implied that Ukraine started the war. Trump's former vice president, Mike Pence, wrote on X, Mr. President, Ukraine did not start this war. Russia launched an unprovoked and brutal invasion, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. The road to peace must be built on the truth. Trump's former UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, also weighed in, writing, these are classic Russian talking points, exactly what Putin wants. And from the left, Senator Bernie Sanders also chimed in, writing, we are witnessing a very sad moment in American history. The President of the United States is aligning himself with the dictator of Russia, Vladimir Putin, to undermine the independence of Ukraine and its democracy.
Then there are Trump's allies who have a different view. AI czar David Sachs jumped in, posting on X, Gonzalo Lira was an American citizen arrested in Ukraine for posting YouTube videos critical of Zelenskyy. He then died in a Ukrainian prison, exactly as he predicted in his last public statement. Dictator is as dictator does. Of course, Elon wrote on X, Zelenskyy cannot claim to represent the will of the people of Ukraine unless he restores freedom of the press and stops canceling elections. So I have a lot of thoughts on this. Look,
so do I. We'll have much to talk about here.
I don't agree with Trump, trying to put the blame for the war's start on Zelenskyy. Obviously, that doesn't make sense. They got invaded by Russia. I also think shifting the blame to Zelenskyy himself actually gets away with the U.S.'s own blame for encouraging them to, arming, funding, and encouraging them to fight to the last man. That was the President Biden standpoint. All that said, I absolutely agree with Trump and his strategy that we need to negotiate with Putin. I think it's crazy Biden did not speak with Putin for 3 years. We need to bring this war to an end. We are not willing to continue paying for it. There is no military strategy for Ukraine to defeat Russia. Military advisors to Zelenskyy and to our government don't think that's possible. So the reality is, as uncomfortable as we might be about it, there have to be peace talks, and I think peace talks with Russia are entirely appropriate and should have taken place already, and Zelenskyy is going to have to live with that.
So I think the starting point has to be some of the false claims that Trump made either in that Truth Social post or elsewhere in recent days. He describes Zelenskyy as a dictator without elections. Zelenskyy was elected in 2019. In the runoff election that year, he got 75% of the vote. We noted in our introduction that in time of war or martial law, it is permissible under Ukraine's constitution to suspend elections, as Britain did during the Second World War, for example.
In a minute, but go ahead.
Okay. Trump said that the US has spent $350 billion. It has spent about half that, or that sum, nowhere near $350 billion. He said that Zelenskyy, quote, admits that half of the money we sent has gone missing, or maybe missing. He has not admitted that. He made a separate comment in an AP interview, which was about the fact that, as other outside bodies have acknowledged, the total amount apportioned for Ukraine has not yet been delivered. About 86 billion of 130 billion has actually come through. And as you say, he said that Ukraine started the war. The war was started by Russia invading a neighbouring sovereign country. So all those things are wrong. So I think that is obviously something that the President of the United States needs to be called out on, self-evidently. Then there's a separate issue or a separate debate, which is the one that I think concerns you more, which is what are we going to do about it right now? And there is I think, genuinely difficult choice, because the choice is either you let Putin emerge with, at the very least, a moral victory and some significant share of Ukrainian territory, which then runs the risk of emboldening him and weakening America's global influence and power, or you don't do that, you fight on, and then what is the plan for Ukraine to ultimately prevail? That's a genuinely difficult choice.
Yeah, and I haven't heard anyone propose a plan to accomplish the latter, or else I might feel differently. But if it's just going to be more deaths and then some kind of plan that's even more favorable to Russia because they've taken more territory, I don't think that's what anyone wants. On the point about Zelenskyy being a dictator, yes, he was elected in the first place, and yes, under their system, you don't have to under systems of various European countries, right? The UK is like this too. They could suspend an election if they did.
In 1945 was the first British general election.
But that's weird to
years.
Us Americans, because we hold elections round the clock every 4 years, regardless of what's going on.
Yeah, but you haven't been invaded in modern history. I mean,
we had it in the midst of the Civil War. We had it in the midst of World War II.
The analog would be something like, because I mean, obviously Russia occupies roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory. Yeah. The analog would be something like if a foreign army was occupying the Deep South. Would the United States have a presidential election? And if the people in the Deep South were not able to vote, would the outcome of that election be legitimate?
But and liberals understand this with Netanyahu, right? That his incentive to continue the war, to stay in political power, is perverse. If Zelenskyy is waiting until the war is over in order to hold an election he might very well lose, doesn't he have perverse incentives then?
Well, surely the point is that a foreign power is occupying a fifth of his country. Like, I don't think you can really say, well, he's keeping the war going for selfish reasons, while a foreign army is occupying a fifth of his country. Like, what's he supposed to do? Just say, oh, well, that's fine. Let's just not worry about that.
I think he should act to protect the lives of his people, and continuing to fight Russia is not going to accomplish that. I also don't take lightly the suspension of rival political parties in media.
What's the alternative from Zelensky's view? I understand you don't want the U.S. to spend the money to do it, but what is the alternative from Zelensky's view? He should just accept that Russia has a fifth of the country, and thanks, that's okay?
That's what they're going to have to accept regardless. No one has proposed any plan to me to prevent that from being the case. Under what scenario does Ukraine regain that territory? I can't conceive of it, and no one can explain it to me.
I think the scenario is one in which the attritional effects on Russia, both in terms of troop losses and economic damage from sanctions and so forth, becomes too difficult to continue at the current pace.
But no one has suggested that that's going to work, or that that's going to hurt Russia more than Ukraine. That's just going to be even more death and destruction for the Ukrainian people itself. So it seems weird to say that it's being good to Ukraine because we care so much about the Ukrainian people. We want more of them to be used as cannon fodder because we don't like Russia and want to make things more difficult for them.
Well, we also don't want Russia to invade and be rewarded for an invasion of a neighboring country by getting a large share of that country's territory. Isn't that a legitimate aspiration, at least, a legitimate principle?
Of course it's a legitimate principle, but there's no feasible or realistic plan because we're not willing to go to war with Russia itself directly in order to defend a country that is not technically part of NATO. So some arrangement where they keep probably the territory they took, and there's a promise that we would defend the rest or Europe will defend the rest of Ukraine so they can't invade them. Also his point that if this is so important, Europe could contribute more to the defense of Ukraine seems perfectly valid to me. You quibbled over the specific numbers that Trump gave, and
I quibbled because he doubled the number.
Okay, the Pentagon fails 7 audits in a row. They have no idea how much money they spend on various projects. Tons have been lost in Middle Eastern conflicts. You can't just say, the
Pentagon failed several audits, so I, as the President of the United States, will just talk nonsense anytime I get to name figures about something.
Okay, the figure was different than what he said. I don't know that it's talking nonsense to worry about the amount of money we're spending in Ukraine and how it gets spent. You don't think
it is important for the President of the United States raising concerns about expenditure to lie about what that expenditure is?
He should use the correct numbers.
I agree.
Okay. Excellent. Coming up next on Rising, the measles outbreak in Texas has ramped up, and many are asking questions about RFK Jr.'s nomination to HHS because of that. We will discuss and debate. Doesn't look like the measles outbreak in West Texas has slowed down. As of Tuesday, the number of cases had risen to 58.
There are also around 8 cases in the neighboring state of New Mexico. Most of the cases are in Gaines County, Texas, numbering 45. Many parents in that small county send their kids to private schools, and some are homeschooled, and obviously the vaccine rules there might not be as stringent. Terry County has 9 cases, and Lubbock and Lynn County each have 2.
Lara Anton, a health department spokesperson, said that a close-knit, under-vaccinated Mennonite community are where the cases are clustered. Reports say that 4 of those patients are vaccinated, and the rest were either unvaccinated or their status is unknown. Measles, of course, is an extremely contagious disease that can cause rashes all over the body, fever, running nose, and a cough.
The Wall Street Journal's editorial board ran an op-ed addressing the elephant in the room, titled RFK Jr. and the Measles Outbreak. The board writes, "We are on record as skeptical of RFK Jr.'s nomination. The Senate confirmed him. Now the best case scenario would be for Mr. Kennedy to internalize that he is no longer an activist outsider who needs to take provocative pot shots to get attention. He's the nation's health secretary, and there are children in the hospital with measles who shouldn't have to be there." Now, there's no question Kennedy has a history of being skeptical and critical of vaccines. Before the Senate voted to confirm Kennedy, he did assure Republican Senator Bill Cassidy that he wouldn't alter the childhood vaccine schedule. Kennedy spoke to HHS employees Tuesday, however, and vowed to investigate that childhood vaccine schedule and said nothing was going to be off limits. Here's Kennedy during his confirmation hearing in January.
Senator, I support the measles vaccine. I support the polio vaccine. I will do nothing as HHS secretary that makes it difficult or discourages people from taking either of those vaccines.
But that's a different tone from last year when Kennedy spoke with NBC reporter Alex Tabet. They were discussing a measles outbreak in a Florida elementary school.
So for America's children right now, do you recommend they take the MMR vaccine?
I'm not gonna.
Okay, one last fun question.
To be sure, there have been numerous measles outbreaks in pockets of the country throughout the years. In February 2023, for instance, there was an outbreak in central Ohio with 85 cases. The disease had spread among children who weren't fully vaccinated.
According to the CDC, 2 doses of the MMR vaccine are 97% effective against measles. Some Democrats say that Kennedy's anti-vax stance contributed to the Samoan measles outbreak in 2019. The Samoan government suspended vaccines during Kennedy's visit. Kennedy says that he didn't go to Samoa to talk about vaccines, but rather to introduce a medical informatics system. Bulwark editor Bill Kristol wrote on Blue Sky, "Make measles great again." In response to Cassidy's tweet sounding the alarm on the measles outbreak, MSNBC special correspondent Molly Young-Fast responded, "You voted for RFK Jr."
Meanwhile, here's health author Callie Means on CNN yesterday.
Pamela, with respect, why aren't you asking me about the fact that 50% of teens have obesity? Why aren't there are breathless
I have other questions for you, but we're talking about this.
Day after day after day, Pamela. It's breathless coverage of 5 measles cases. The entire coverage of Bobby Kennedy is around measles. The Democrats said the word measles 25 times in the first hearing and said the words obesity, diabetes, and chronic disease 0 times. The HHS priority document under President Biden said the word equity 25 times, said the word vaccines countless times, did not say the word obesity or diabetes.
Political commentator and filmmaker Mike Cernovich wrote on X, "Measles outbreaks always happened, but media can shape coverage by focusing on isolated incidents. Be prepared for an onslaught of ordinary medical conditions and random outbreaks to reach hysteria levels of coverage." So this is obviously very sad, and I don't want any legal changes to the status of the MMR vaccine so that it can be available to children. I was glad to hear RFK Jr. promise repeatedly to make no alterations to the childhood vaccine schedule. So for me, that's kind of the end of the story here. Am I missing something?
I think so. I think what you're missing is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s history of skepticism about these vaccines, which extends well beyond the COVID vaccines. For example, saying in a very comparatively recent interview in 2023 to Fox News, autism comes from vaccines. That is a claim most frequently made about the MMR vaccine. It has been debunked. It pertained to a British researcher who was then found to have essentially cooked the books in terms of his research, and that, I think, is a dangerous thing to give oxygen to in terms of its claim. I would also say that there isn't any doubt whatsoever that the measles vaccine has been effective. The first widespread measles vaccine was introduced in the early 1960s. Before that, in the United States, there had been 3 to 4 million cases of measles per year, roughly 50,000 people hospitalized per year, and between 400 and 600 deaths in a typical year. Now it is considered bad if there are more than 200 measles cases nationwide. We're now up to 58 in this case in West Texas. So am I saying RFK Jr. is responsible for these cases in West Texas? I am not. I don't think people should, but I do think that advancing vaccine skepticism is going to have very, very serious consequences in this country.
Yeah, I support people taking the measles vaccine. I mean, it's what families do with their kids is not really my business, but I would obviously, if I had children, get them vaccinated for the measles vaccine. I accept all of what you just said. I guess I would put some of this not necessarily on RFK Jr., however, but on the advocates of the COVID vaccine and how they confused everybody about vaccines in general, because the measles vaccine is not like the COVID vaccine in that it is highly protective, not completely protective, because as we've said, we have cases of people who say they were vaccinated against it who nevertheless got the measles, but it is highly protective, 94, 97% successful at preventing a case of you from contracting measles. That is unlike the COVID vaccine. However, even Deborah Birx said recently on Piers Morgan, I talked about it yesterday with Linda, she said she herself now thinks the way the COVID vaccine was sold to the public was a bad idea and has now made people think that other vaccines are like the COVID vaccine, you know, maybe important if you're sick or if you're elderly or obese, but since it doesn't offer really robust protection against cases, maybe that's how those other vaccines work too, which of course is not the case. And she's saying this, and I'm thinking, but you're you're the person who sold the vaccine. So you're describing it as if it's some other, public health expert was the one in charge of this when it really was you and Fauci. So I think some self-reflection there is necessary. The way the COVID vaccines, people were convinced to take them. President Biden himself said, we won't have these, it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated, and we won't have these cases if people get these vaccines. And that just ended up not being the case.
If you think, though, that the danger is emanating from the Faucis and Deborah Birxes of the world, and that then percolates through to a skepticism of other vaccines, isn't the imperative, particularly for the Health Secretary of the United States, to push back against that false linkage or the false percolation of one to the other and be more emphatic about the safety of the other vaccines and the effectiveness of the other vaccines rather than ventilate these false claims of links to autism and so forth?
Sure. He should be emphatically for people investigating whether it's right for them, and it is right for them. I try to not tell people what medical decisions they should make for themselves and for their families, but that the measles vaccine is tremendously effective at preventing you from contracting measles, and you don't want to contract measles because it's a very serious illness that puts like 1 in 5 people who get it in the hospital. Very, very bad. Don't want it. We don't want outbreaks of it. And being for that and making it available. Now, I'm really not for coercion and force except when absolutely necessary. So I don't, we can debate that. The requirements for kids to get them if they're in the public school system, I think can certainly be defended. Are you going to go into people's homes in Mennonite communities who homeschool their kids and make them get vaccinated? If you want to argue for that, you can. I would not personally be willing to do that. I think there are downsides to that, and we really shouldn't force on people or families things they don't want for themselves. Is not really accomplishing the goals of a broader public health. But I understand the argument. It's a debate people have. But yes, I hope he should be for these vaccines and for explaining the difference between these vaccines and the COVID vaccine and the flu vaccine. And yes, that would be a good thing.
I actually think that vaccines are one of the major points where I would differ from a libertarian such as yourself, because it seems to me that vaccinations are one of the best example of where there is a legitimate societal interest in the highest possible rate of vaccination because of herd immunity. And to me, it's an example where if you expand the level of personal choice, you're in fact endangering other people by the choice not to be vaccinated off.
I think you can certainly make that argument with the measles vaccine, but they tried to make that argument with the COVID vaccine, and people who made that argument then had to later confront the fact that it was not offering the kind of broad-based societal protection, that the beneficiary of that vaccine is you, the main beneficiary, is you, the person who takes it, if you are going to be in a category where you're at risk of serious disease or death from COVID. The public health benefit was massively overstated, and it was, forced on people on that basis.
When you say the public health benefit was overstated, though, I mean, the fact is that it does protect people to a very large extent from hospitalization and death, which is a not insignificant benefit.
Yes, of people who are in certain categories of being over 65, obese, ill, immunocompromised. People not in those categories had such a minuscule risk of a serious outcome anyway. That now I don't think the vaccine is harmful.
You got it, right?
I've got it. I've gotten boosted because I am not persuaded. The people who say, well, you shouldn't get it because of these XYZ dangers, I am not persuaded that those dangers are real and compelling. I think the harms were overstated by skeptics of vaccine, but also the benefits are overstated. There's just my thinking was, well, if it doesn't hurt you, why not take it? But there's also not a massive benefit because I'm not in a...
I mean, except that you never know. There are, of course, freak cases in all kinds of instances where people who are able-bodied and healthy and young do actually die from it.
No, I mean, but then there's... Well, if you bring those in, then you can say, I mean, there are freak cases of, vaccines resulting in a serious adverse effect. Like it's not a rare occurrence. You shouldn't... Or it is a rare occurrence, rather. That shouldn't weigh against you, but nor should the... It was a bit overstated in the media that the odds that which you, an otherwise perfectly healthy person or a perfectly healthy child, could get COVID and just die of it. That it can't not happen, but it can happen with a vaccine too. The serious good that they were where you were improving upon expected conditions was for the very elderly, the obese, etc. And what this Deborah Birx said this yesterday. We discussed it. If we'd prioritized talking to those people about the necessity to get it, she thinks that would have been a better strategy for the not making vaccine hesitancy about the measles.
We shall return, I'm sure, to this theme.
Next on Rising, get this, Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass is investigating why she was allowed to embark on a trip to Ghana just before the start of the LA wildfires. She's going to get to the bottom of it. Who made that call, I wonder? Stay with us. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass is launching an investigation into herself.
Or sort of. Bass sat down with Fox 11 for an exclusive interview. She told the outlet that nobody told her going to Ghana was a bad idea because of potential disastrous wildfires.
Bass said, quote, "That level of preparation really didn't happen, so it didn't reach that level to me to say that something terrible could happen and maybe you shouldn't have gone on the trip." She's referring to herself. The interviewer then asked why this was the case, to which Bass responded that she was launching multiple investigations.
Back in January, journalist Lee Fang reported on Substack that there were multiple warnings from agencies like the National Weather Service and the U.S. Forest Service just days before the fires took place.
Even though LA Mayor Karen Bass had left for Ghana before the fire started, Fang argues there were plenty of public warnings and the mayor's office should have known about it and been prepared. He also writes, defenders of the mayor claim that criticisms of her absence is unfair given that there was no way to know when the crisis would strike. That, however, is just not true. Her office was well aware of the risk. She still traveled abroad.
The fires began January the 7th in the Palisades that spread to nearly 24,000 acres and demolished more than 6,800 buildings. California government data shows that 12 people died as a result of the fires.
Conservative political commentator Charlie Kirk wrote on X, LA Mayor Karen Bass says she's really just a victim for being allowed to travel to Ghana when forecasts predicted massive Santa Ana winds that led to catastrophic fires. She says there will be an investigation as to why she was victimized. Unreal spin. And Fox Business correspondent Charles Gasparino wrote on X, the real question that needs to be answered is why was Karen Bass considered a rising star in the Dem Party, but Josh Shapiro considered too moderate to be VP? we are talking about some real problems here. This was a great interview of Karen Bass. I wish we can play it, but we can't actually play it, which makes me a sad panda, where she's asked, who's responsible for this? She's like, we got to figure out who was responsible for allowing me to go to Ghana. I'm like, well, that's you, lady. That's so clearly you. There's no whose job was to say to you, maybe this is I guess she's supposed to have better advisors, warn you, don't go on this trip. The whole thing was just a hilarious example of blame shifting to someone else. We got to get to the bottom of this. I'm sure there's someone responsible for your personal decision to go to Ghana.
So let me adopt perhaps my single most unpopular position, which is a defense of the authorities in the LA wildfires, and Karen Bass in particular. Firstly, her point is that she says the warnings of the severity of the fires did not reach her. Lee Fang argues otherwise. They can litigate that between themselves if they have the chance. She says the warnings didn't reach her, and that the investigations, one of which was actually launched by Gavin Newsom, as I understand it, is partly to find out that, among other things, and why the preparedness wasn't what it should be. The bigger point to me is no one that I have seen has ever pointed out what would have been substantively different about the city's response to the wildfires if Karen Bass had been sitting in Glendale rather than Ghana. The problem with the LA wildfires, and I've said this on this show and elsewhere numerous times, is there was a multiple location wildfire driven by winds of almost 100 miles an hour on the first night. If you have winds of 100 miles an hour, you can't put helicopters in the air to try to quash a fire from the air. You are therefore dependent on fire trucks and hydrants. And there is no system, and this is an expert opinion, it's not my pontificating about it, there is no municipal system anywhere in any major city in the US where you could get sufficient volumes of water out of hydrants to fight wildfires on that scale. And wherever Karen Bass is or was, doesn't change that reality.
That's all fine. She promised not to leave the state of California except to travel to Washington, D.C. That was a campaign promise she made that she violated. I don't think it would have made any difference. I just don't know why. I mean, she clearly thinks she's in trouble over it because she's embarrassed and she's trying to blame someone else for having made this decision. So she thinks the optics of it look not good. Even if nothing was going to be different, you're used to in a crisis having the politician, roll up their sleeves, talking to the rescue workers, talking to the victims. That's kind of politics 101. She wasn't on hand to do it. You're right. Nothing would have been different about the fire itself. It's just, it's a broken promise and it doesn't look good. And she's, taking flack for it as she deserves. And there's no one else to blame but her for doing it.
The optics of it are bad. And I think she's aware of that. And I think everyone's aware of that. And I wouldn't deny that. I think that the optics, anytime there is a major problem and a politician appears either not to be fully engaged or to be in some way not exactly dismissive. I don't think that's right in Bass's case. But, we can look through, like Ted Cruz being in Cancun when there was the ice storm.
And he was attacked. He was attacked for that, including by conservatives. He got mocked widely for that.
Right.
Or that, just everyone, or even media figures who, left New York or cities to go hide out in their personal bungalows during COVID. They got mocked for that. I know Pete Buttigieg got criticized, not for visiting East Palestine, I think, or taking a while to visit. This is a bipartisan, people on both sides of the political spectrum get criticized for this kind of thing. So there's nothing new about it.
The optics I've just said were bad. What I object to is people saying, oh, she was in Ghana, as if it would all have been different. It wouldn't have been different at all, regardless of where she had been. I get that it's a useful political weapon to use against her, just as Ted heading off to Cancun in the ice storm was a useful weapon for Liberals against him. But it doesn't actually affect the outcome. And one of the things that irritates me about the whole debate about the LA wildfires is that I think there are just constant hyperbolic or incorrect claims, like Trump's whole thing about water from the north, a point that has nothing to do with the firefighting capabilities of the city of Los Angeles. So when we talk about these things, if you want to say Karen Bass, it was politically embarrassing for her to be in Africa, yeah, it was, but it wouldn't have changed the outcome. No burning building would not have burnt. None of the people who sadly lost their lives would have been saved if she had been in LA instead of Ghana.
Yeah, it's true, but it was true of Ted Cruz when he got so widely mocked for that. Yes, it doesn't matter if the politician is there. I don't know, maybe I'm supposed to argue that the politician is actually just a distraction, and they should all take vacations to Ghana or elsewhere.
Or libertarian positions.
Just get out of our cities, get out of our countries, go take a vacation and never come back. All of you. Next up, Free Press reporter Tanya Lukyanova joins us to discuss the relationship between the U.S. and Ukrainian media, U.S.A.I.D. Stay tuned.
One of the many things that U.S.A.I.D. supported was the promotion of a free press around the globe. Ukraine was a massive beneficiary, with one American NGO providing support to 536 media outlets in Ukraine, training over 5,000 journalists. The funds to do that came from U.S.A.I.D. According to one Ukrainian press freedom group, 9 out of 10 media outlets in the country survived thanks to grants from the West, and that has allowed many outlets to hold the powerful to account.
But here's where things get a bit dicey. The money at times came with strings attached. If Ukrainian journalists wanted to stray from the government's narrative, well, that wasn't always possible. Tanya Lukyanova, who writes about Ukraine and Russia for the Free Press, recently investigated these ties between U.S.A.I.D. and Ukrainian media in an article called How the U.S. Government Controls Ukrainian Media. And she's here with us now to discuss. Welcome to Rising.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. It was a great article. Describe for us the kinds of restrictions or policies that Ukrainian media outlets that received these funds had to follow, and these restrictions imposed on them by the U.S. Tell us about it.
Well, so one big subject in Ukraine that's been going on since, as early as late 2022 has been the practice of forced conscription. The military conscription units in Ukraine, the TCC, they have been accused of kidnapping men from the streets, forcing them onto the front lines against their will, sometimes detaining them at length and torturing them. And this practice is well documented through dozens of videos on social media, as well as reports from independent journalists in Ukraine. But this practice was barely covered in many of the U.S.A.I.D. funded, quote-unquote, independent media publications. And not only has this topic not been well covered, but those journalists who have been risking their freedom to expose these abuses by the government have found themselves target of coordinated smear campaigns by many of these U.S.A.I.D. funded Ukraine media outlets.
How was this story reported, Tanya? I mean, did you go to Ukraine to report this, or were you reporting on this, from here?
I was reporting on it based in the U.S. And, it started while I was helping my incredible colleague and another investigative reporter at the Free Press, Matt Rowley, who was looking at U.S.A.I.D. funds in Ukrainian agriculture sector. And I just started calling every single source that I have on the ground in Ukraine, because I've been covering the Russia-Ukraine war pretty much since the beginning for a range of publications, starting with the Wall Street Journal and Semaphore, for whom I was doing investigative pieces about things like Russia's war crimes in Mariupol and the Kyiv region. So I've been covering the subject for at least 3 years now, and within that time frame, I've developed a kind of pretty big base of contacts and sources inside the country. And so I started calling everybody I know. And one of my journalist friends who's based in Ukraine, he said, I don't know anything about the agriculture sector, but you might want to talk to some of my Ukrainian journalist friends who have had firsthand experience with the U.S.A.I.D. funded media censorship.
And U.S.A.I.D. has come under tremendous scrutiny in recent weeks as Elon Musk and Doge have targeted some of the funding it does. I guess my question is, we are so proud of the First Amendment here in the U.S. It goes without saying that media outlets are and should be free to criticize government policies in the U.S. The defenders of U.S.A.I.D. say this funding is important to encourage friends around the globe to be aligned with, I guess, Western liberal freedom principles and policies. We want to support those policies. So if the funding comes attached to strings that, we don't want negative coverage of, the Zelenskyy government or various policies of it, doesn't that run totally counter to the spirit of what America is all about?
Well, that's exactly right. And I think you point to the very crux of the story. I think that the most scandalous thing to me in reporting this had been the fact that American taxpayer dollars, which were meant to explicitly fund a free press in Ukraine and foster independent journalism that is meant to hold the government accountable, was going towards not only the suppression of the truth, but also the smear campaigns against the journalists who risk their freedom to expose these government abuses. I think that is the biggest, that's the biggest scandal to me here.
And Tanya, I just want to be clear about something in terms of the idea of there being strings attached. I guess my question is, do we think that they were funding outlets that would already have been, for example, generally reluctant to cover the forced conscription issue anyway? In other words, were they choosing outlets that might have an ideological tint that they already favored? Or is there any evidence that there were, as it were, directives issued that you can't cover X, Y, or Z?
I mean, it's hard to say because none of the outlets that were U.S.A.I.D funded agreed to an interview with me. So we can only speculate. But the U.S.A.I.D funding has been going to the outlets, since at least 2008. Probably much sooner. We know that the NGO Internews, which was the primary funder of the Ukrainian independent media, has been operating in Ukraine since 1993. So, it's hard to say how much of it had been the explicit directive versus some level of self-censorship that has also been instilled in Ukraine. But as I write in my article, wartime censorship is a universal and timeless practice. So it's understandable that perhaps the Ukrainian government would want to restrict certain speech, as Ukraine has been fighting for its existence since the Russian aggression started in 2022. But it's one thing for the government to try to pass laws to restrict speech, and it's quite another, as I said, for the American grants that were meant to foster independent journalism to support the same suppression and support the same censorship.
Can you give us more details about the smear campaign you say took place against other independent journalists in Ukraine who were covering the, for instance, conscription issue?
Yes. One of the interesting details about the whole situation is that most of it is recorded on video. The couple of independent journalists who were covering the issue, they were mostly organizing live streams with either people who have had direct experience with the TCC, the military conscription units, or their loved ones. So during one such live stream, one independent journalist who was on the line with a man who was claiming that he had been illegally detained for days by a military conscription unit, he was beaten live on camera during the live stream. But instead of covering that story, most of the U.S.A.I.D funded media outlets ran a hit piece on the journalist who organized the live stream, calling him an anti-vaxxer, and a man who, they alleged that he was, calling for armed resistance to conscription units, that he was spreading Kremlin propaganda. There is another journalist who was also reporting in a similar manner on forced conscription by the virtue of talking to some of the people who were involved, first had experience with the military conscription units. There was also a coordinated campaign against him where he said, some paragraphs on these media outlets were copied word for word. So it was clear that they were given the same memo. And not only were there campaigns organized against them, but they were arrested. One independent journalist spent 60 days under arrest before he was freed on bail by some of his supporters. The other is now awaiting trial, and he's facing up to 10 years in prison for, basically, as they claim, their biggest crime is sort of standing in the way of the Ukrainian armed forces and conscription.
Tanya, sorry to cut across you, but just to fit one quick question in before we run out of time here, what's your expectation about what happens to these media outlets now, where they depend on U.S.A.I.D. to the point that they will now become extinct, or will they be able to continue in more depleted form?
Well, according to that same press freedom group that has said that 9 out of 10 media outlets in the country have relied on the Western grants to survive, they estimate that some 60% of these media outlets may go out of business. Some outlets, by their own admission, had their funding up to 80% of their entire operation covered by these grants. So there's a good chance that many of them will fold. Some of them may try to get crowdfunded and survive through subscriptions. It's hard to say now, but it appears likely that many of these outlets will go out of business, since the majority of their funding, in many cases, came from the U.S. grants.
Tanya Lukyanova of the Free Press, excellent reporting. Thank you so much for joining Rising. Thank you so much for inviting me. Next up, the British are coming. What do I mean by that? I'll tell you. Stay with us. The British are coming. Actually, they're already here, as I know all too well, Niall. Despite the War of 1812 having resolved some time ago, but in the mainstream media, there are a lot of British people running things. The once legendary Washington Post, known for its Watergate coverage, is helmed now by Will Lewis, a veteran from Fleet Street. Mark Thompson, formerly of the BBC, now leads CNN. And then there is, of course, Vogue's Anna Wintour.
The problem here, obviously, is not Irish people, it's purely British people and English people in particular. Like Politico Playbook's managing editor and author of Playbook, Jack Blanchard, who's making headlines yet again. He was an unusual hire to write a newsletter that much of Washington's power-playing class wakes up to.
In Monday's edition of Playbook, Blanchard wrote this: from reshaping the global security map to triggering a global trade war, from gutting the federal government to transforming the conversation on immigration, diversity, and gender rights, plus plenty more besides. Trump has been back in the White House for just 4 weeks. Has any previous U.S. leader made such an impact in such a short space of time?
In Tuesday's edition of Playbook, Blanchard had to roll back his words on consequential presidents. He wrote, thanks to all who emailed in to suggest Franklin D. Roosevelt had a more impactful start to his presidency than the latest iteration of Donald J. Trump. Per the question posed in yesterday's Playbook. Long hours of trawling through the historical archives? Okay, reading this Wikipedia entry suggests you may have a point.
Maybe the Playbook should be written by an American. This was really funny.
It was a good story.
Yeah, he literally, so FDR, as most people who've taken, even like basic high school level U.S. history know, was an incredibly influential president, particularly at the very start, passing all sorts of new laws and orders aimed to combat the Great Depression. You got a wave of new alphabet agencies to manage the economy, to create jobs. Libertarians hate it all, and we can argue about it, but there's no argument that it wasn't significant and unparalleled. There was no president up until that point who had done all that much in such short a time, and really no president after either. Maybe Donald Trump is competing in this category, but that's the GOAT in terms of immediate, swift, decisive action. It's FDR, someone who the Playbook author, because he's a Brit, had never heard of. And I'm yelling at you, but you're not a Brit. You're Irish. Exactly. You have as much contempt for the British as I do.
Well, exactly. I'm obviously in a complicated position here, both defending the presence of foreigners in the American media and eager to
taking our jobs
and eager to put the boot into the English for 800 years of oppression and all of that.
Yes,
but look, the difficult. Look, it's a fun story. We're not really giving him that vicious a kicking. But the point is, if he had said in the second day's Playbook, people have mentioned FDR, and of course he did have all these, accomplishments. That would have been fine, but it was the idea that he kind of looked up Wikipedia to figure out who this FDR guy was that people were talking about. That's probably not a great look.
Yeah, although, Playbook. In all truth, That's what I do when I don't know anything about a subject. I go to Wikipedia. It's not like I go to the I go to my personal library and take off a tome on
a biography of FDR
and read through it. Actually, I was reading an FDR biography on Wikipedia. I was just reading the Wikipedia page on FDR like last week before this all happened at random. Wikipedia is a fine source of information. You're just not supposed to admit that that's where you're getting your information.
Native-born American and Michigander Robby Suave has to go to Wikipedia to find out about it.
They should, I mean, imagine if I got hired by, like, the BBC or something to write a newsletter about Downing Street. I would just be totally I have a passing familiarity with not with really modern British history. I was a European history minor, so I understand the early modern period and the Tudors and the Stuarts pretty well.
But the analogy, even though this is off by a couple of decades, I suppose, would be you doing that and then be like, I hear of something about Margaret Thatcher, so let me look her up on Google and see what the situation is. There is, I think, a fair assumption that if you're going to be writing about a nation's politics, you should have some passing knowledge of the major figures, at least in 20th and 21st century history.
Yeah, it is incredible.
Can I just point out something, because this comes up in our comment section quite a lot, about where I'm actually from
and
what my nationality is.
Let us know.
So I was born and raised in Belfast in the north of Ireland, which automatically gives me dual citizenship. Someone in my situation is permitted to be a citizen of either Ireland or Britain. I have only ever carried an Irish passport for political reasons, but I'm not Scottish, as many of our commentators seem to think.
Oh, they think you're Scottish.
Yes, and so there we go. Happy to clarify.
Well, when I do impersonations of you off camera, my Irish accents and my Scottish accents come out exactly the same. I go from one to the other.
North of Ireland and Scotland are very similar accent-wise, and in fact, from close to where I grew up, you can look across and see Scotland on a clear day, much like Sarah Palin looking to Russia.
And obviously some people from the British Isles would be perfectly adept at writing, and like yourself would be perfectly adept at writing a newsletter about Washington politics, because you have been covering it for years and years and years and are very expert in it. So there's nothing against people doing jobs Americans don't want to do, unwilling to do, cover our own politics. We need to bring in,
outsiders.
Import people to do it for us.
Absolutely.
Well, coming up next, this is exciting. The post-millennials Andy Ngo will join Rising to discuss the arrest of an alleged leader of what he described as a transgender vegan cult. Police have arrested the alleged leader of a so-called transgender vegan cult. I say those words again, a transgender vegan cult. Now, they're allegedly linked to 6 deaths across the U.S.
The alleged leader's name is Jack Ziz Lesota. The police say that Lesota founded an anarchist group called the Zizians. The members are apparently smart and well-educated. Some are computer scientists who have worked for Google and NASA.
Law enforcement say that they hold radical views on issues like AI, veganism, and gender ideology. In one instance, 2 people allegedly killed a Border Patrol agent after he stopped their car in Vermont on Inauguration Day. The guns the suspects allegedly used were connected to this cult. In a piece for the New York Post in late January, reporter Andy Ngo said that before all of that, federal law enforcement were surveilling 2 suspects before the alleged shooting.
Staff from a motel in Vermont called police after allegedly seeing these people with a gun, black tactical clothing, Ngo writes. Cops showed up, the pair told them they were looking at property, and nothing really happened. The Border Patrol incident allegedly happened some days later. Ngo also writes that one of the suspects' parents had reported her missing in 2024.
Ngo dives a little deeper, writing, their leader, Jack Ziz Lesota, is a biological male who identifies as a woman, also uses the name Andrea Phelps, and is accused of influencing followers to kill. Lesota's archived prolific blog writings ramble about the use of violence and radical anarchist tactics to achieve various ends. His supporters say he died in 2022, but that appeared to be based on a fake online obituary to try to escape the law. Here to make sense of this story is Andy Ngo himself. Andy, thank you for joining Rising.
My pleasure.
Nice to see you. Tell us more about this cult leader and the ideology. How are they recruiting people, and it seems to be resulting in actual violent assaults?
Well, on the surface, the story does sound sort of like, I believe the Boston Globe said, made up from far-right memes. But as you outlined, there's a whole trail of bodies from across the United States, killings that go back to 2022. Now, the shooting death of the Border Patrol agent in Vermont, that was sort of the catalyst that linked all these other homicides that have happened together to this group or cult, you could call it. The ideology that they espouse is esoteric and difficult to comprehend, but it includes aspects of leftist anarchism, veganism, and also transhumanism. And its leader is Jack Lasota. He had faked his death in 2022. His counsel told the court in Solana County, California, in the Bay Area, that his client had died, apparently in a boating accident. But he was arrested in 2023 in Delaware County in the course of an investigation in Pennsylvania of a double homicide. And then his bail of $500,000 was reduced to $10,000, and he bailed out and disappeared until his arrest last weekend in western rural Maryland. And he wasn't alone. He was with another person of interest in several other homicide investigations, Michelle Zako, as well as another member named Daniel Blank.
Andy, one of the things we try to do all the time on Rising is make it clear that people are entitled, of course, to their day in court if they are facing criminal charges. Now, Lasota's lawyer has said that he will plead not guilty, I think, to any charges, right? He says that Lasota is innocent of the things he's been accused of, and I think that goes for several of the other people involved in this story. Is that correct?
So Lasota, what's interesting about the prior criminal cases against him in California and Pennsylvania, he's actually never been formally charged with homicide or being accessory to murder. In California, there's a 2019 criminal case related to essentially a protest riot that he and his comrades were allegedly involved in the Bay Area. And in Delaware County, in the double homicide investigation, he was charged with obstruction. So the accusations against the group is that he influences and or radicalizes his followers into committing acts of violence. And there are two people who have a trial upcoming in Solana County, California in April. A witness to that case who survived a prior attempted assassination on his life was killed in January by another alleged member of the group. That person is in custody. He's a man named Maximilian Snyder, who's originally from Seattle. He is the fiance or husband, I should say, of the female suspect who was apprehended after the deadly shootout in Vermont. So Jack Lasota over and over has never formally been accused of one who slits someone's throat or pulls the trigger. And actually at his first court hearing in Allegheny County, Maryland, earlier this week, he said, this is almost verbatim, "I don't know why I'm here. I didn't do anything wrong." He was very dismissive of the misdemeanor charges against him, and his big concern was that he would be given a vegan diet.
And the person arrested alongside Jack Lasota, this Michelle Zashko, this is the individual you're referring to, according to news reports, her parents were shot in the head and killed 2 years ago, and she was a person of interest in that case, but then was not charged in connection with that. Is that correct?
That's right. So nobody's been charged with the double homicide investigation in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. And that happened on New Year's Eve in late 2022. The two who were shot execution style in their home are the Rita and Richard Zako, and they're the elderly parents of Michelle. She is their only child. She, after her grandmother died shortly after her parents died, she was the sole benefactor of all the properties and assets that her parents had. She has not been charged with their killing. She was federally charged this week with over allegedly making a false statement in the purchase of a firearm. And that's the only federal charge against her. And the charges in Maryland have to do with obstruction, resisting arrest, illegal firearm possession offenses. So, however, because federal authorities are involved and they're cooperating with the local authorities, the judge did deny all three of them bail. I was holding my breath a bit. I was concerned that Jack Lasota and the other two were going to be let out because the accusations, at least in Maryland, are essentially nonviolent misdemeanors. However, the judge did deny bail, so they're currently still in custody.
What do we know, Andy, about this group in terms of, beyond the allegations of criminality, what do we know about its size? Are we talking about a very small group of people? Or are we talking about a more significant membership? And also, what about its origins? I mean, I noticed that Lesotho does go by the name Ziz, and the group is the Zizians. So was it Lesotho who essentially set it up?
The group has its origins around 2016, which is when the blogging of Mr. Lesotho began, and he used the alias online as Ziz. The writings cover a number of issues. A lot of it is standard leftist anarchist views about punching Nazis and whatnot. And then some of it goes into more esoteric things, quite cult-like things about different hemispheres of the brain and the use of sleep denial to control different personalities that are in the mind. Lesotho's writings and its members the group's members are all highly educated, intelligent. They've worked, Lesotho himself had worked for NASA several summers in a row. Michelle Zako did as well. One of the deceased members who died in the course of a attempted assassination in 2022 worked at Google. So it attracts people who are transgender and very high IQ and highly educated, particularly in the sciences. And veganism is very central to the ideology. Jack Lesotho also made that quite clear at his first court hearing. And what seems like a paradox, though, is that even though the group believes that it is immoral for humans to eat animals, it is permittable for them to kill people who somehow get in their way. And their ideology has a whole way of their beliefs are sort of an offshoot of rationalism, and they believe that their attacks on others are preemptive self-defense. So every violent action that they do is actually just an act of retribution or it's self-defense, and it's justified in some way.
Yeah, the IQ, the level of intelligence of these people, the fact that many of them held, important positions that jobs you can only have if you are very smart, is I think what makes this a little unusual. It sounds to me like what you're describing is a kind of Charles Manson cult type thing, but of course in that case the members, the people who fell under Manson's influence were kind of vagrant, tippy people. Manson himself had been in and out of prison his whole life, whereas these are people who had excelled in highly competitive workplace environments to some degree.
That's right. Jack Lesotho went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and he studied computer engineering. When he was undergrad, he interned multiple years in a row at NASA, and then he at some point relocated to the Bay Area. I believe it was around 2016, and around 2017 is when sort of the beginning of this group started. First, they were living small commune, you could argue, on a tugboat in the Bay Area, and then eventually they relocated to a plot of land. They befriended a man and he lent them property on his lot in Vallejo in 2020, and this was the man that they allegedly conspired to kill in 2022. He had a firearm for self-defense. He shot one of them dead, shot one of the other attackers. Third attacker was uninjured. And so he's 82 years old, and he was killed earlier this month in really shocking circumstances, brutal circumstances. And that trial may be in jeopardy since he was the only person who had witnessed the 22 attack. and he can no longer testify because he was murdered.
Andy No, thank you so much for joining Rising to fill us in on these details. They are fascinating and horrifying. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Next up, George Clooney was on with Steven Colbert. We'll discuss. Stay tuned. We have some breaking news. Mitch McConnell, Republican senator, a longtime leader of the Republicans in the Senate, will not be running for re-election in 2026. He is 83 years old as of today, and he will be exiting the Senate at the end of this term. So this is perhaps not a surprising announcement, given a lot of concerns with his age, his frailty. He has looked to be not in great condition lately. I believe he had a fall sometime in the last week.
Quite recently, yeah.
He's had a number of falls. There were obviously a couple moments of him freezing on camera in the last year or two that concerned a lot of people. He is no longer the leader of the Republican faction in the Senate. He has passed on that role, but now he will also be out of the Senate at the end of this term. You know, this is a figure who was tremendously powerful and influential, probably one of the most important Republican congressional leaders in our nation's history, overseeing the confirmation of several the Republican efforts to get through Supreme Court justices who back conservative policy agenda, judges just more broadly. And so a very important figure, although one who has recently become very maligned by Trump and the MAGA movement, as he is seen as kind of representing an older guard, personal hostility with Trump, has voted against several of his cabinet picks, Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr. So he's kind of going out on a low note for him, even though he has been responsible for so much conservative policy being implemented.
Absolutely. The news itself is not a surprise. For a man turning 83 who has had some of the freezes that we have mentioned and you know, in general, is increasingly, I think, in frail condition.
Only in Congress is it even a question whether you'd retire at that point.
That's very true. But I do think that the bigger and more important point is the change of the Republican Party from a kind of McConnell-esque party to a Trumpian party. Now, I think that the McConnell party had plenty of cynicism and all the rest to it as well. You know, famously, I mean, you mentioned the Supreme Court justices. I think on the Liberal side of this country's divides, he's often remembered for having blocked Merrick Garland when President Barack Obama nominated Garland in 2016. And McConnell's rationale for doing that was, well, really, the American people should get to decide at an upcoming election who they want to have that power. Then, at a later point of the Trump presidency, Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett. That was in September 2020, and McConnell backed that and had no issue at all, didn't think it should wait for another election after all. So that's the kind of politics that he represents. Setting aside the Supreme Court issue, obviously much more interventionist, much more supportive of American involvement in Ukraine, for example, which you and I were talking about earlier, and just generally more very much more identified with the Republican Party of sort of big business, corporate interests, foreign policy interventionism, those kind of things. Not a populist by any stretch of the imagination.
No, not a populist by any stretch of the imagination. Not, I would say, not particularly a libertarian either, although maybe his economic policies are ones I like, although I'm not sure that that's really what puts him in conflict with Trump. It was mostly personal. You know, he criticized Trump for the events of January 6th and Trump's election behavior. And then, yes, in recent years, he has been a full-throated defender of interventionism, of using American dollars to project American strength, of defending Ukraine, of all of that, very a neoconservative kind of ideology to him that has just fallen out of fashion so much on the right that is not what the MAGA base wants, to the extent now he's portrayed in conservative media as a rhino, you know, despite being more responsible than anyone else for conservative wins on Roe v. Wade and a host of other issues. He's thought of as a rhino for where he stands now. It's you know, it's the old it's the quote from Batman that you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. He's been in that role so long that he is now very much not with the times of where MAGA is.
No, he's not. And one of the difficulties that McConnell has had in recent years is there are good reasons for people of almost all ideological complexions to dislike him or to object to him. I mean, you mentioned the January the 6th issue, and for a lot of Liberals that was the perfect encapsulation of their problem with McConnell, because he got up, I believe it was on the floor of the Senate, and said that he thought that Trump was morally responsible for the events of that day, and then voted to acquit him. And it's like, you have to decide one way or another. He wasn't saying, oh, it was all fine and dandy, as he shouldn't. I mean, my views on that topic are well known. But to actually say Trump was morally responsible for that, but I won't do anything about it, is a very Mitch McConnell approach, in my opinion.
So now the question becomes, who's going to run for this seat? Kentucky, like every state, there are 2 senators. Kentucky's other senator is
your friend,
my favorite
your
senator, Rand Paul, who is of my ideological
Sure.
bent and has been a guest on Rising many times. I make no secret of the fact that I broadly agree with him. Kentucky also has my favorite member of the House, or one of my favorite members of the House, which is Thomas Massie, someone who even people on the left, I think, have some affection for and appreciation for being principled on foreign spending and some of the things he's said regarding the Israel-Gaza conflict. Extremely libertarian member of the House. And I guess the question will be, is he interested in making Kentucky by far the most libertarian Senate delegation and running for that that seat? He would have a lot of support. There's a lot of respect for him in conservative media, I think, and independent media even. So he might, I wonder if he'd want to make a go of it.
Yeah, I mean, Kentucky's an interesting state politically because, of course, despite being a very deep red state, it has a Democratic governor in Andy Beshear. Now, I can't recall off the top of my head, this is literally breaking news about McConnell, I can't recall if Beshear is term limited anytime soon. Would he consider making a Senate run? I would think you would have an uphill climb to be elected to the Senate, but I mean, you would have an uphill climb as a Democrat to be governor, and Beshear did that. So it'll be one to watch for sure.
It will definitely be one to watch. More to come on Rising later today. Please stay with us. The actor who urged Biden to drop out of the 2024 presidential election is speaking out about the election results. That is George Clooney, who appeared on The Late Show with Steven Colbert Tuesday and talked politics.
We're kind of talking around what's sort of the giant elephant always in the room. There's, you know, we all, I was raised a Democrat in Kentucky, so I've had a lot of fun in my life. You can imagine. Yes. It's been nothing but fun.
Sure.
And, you know, I've lost a lot of elections. First time I voted, it was 1980, so I was a Carter guy, and Reagan won.
Sure.
And then I lost to some Bushes, and I won with some Clintons and Obamas, and I lost. And, you know, this is democracy, and this is how it works. And, you know, what the hell are you
How'd it go this time for you? I forgot who you were supporting.
Well, I don't know. What am I supposed to do? You know, storm the f***ing Capitol? You know, it's like, it didn't work out. That's what happens.
There you go. Next time.
It's part of democracy.
The actor also shared a message for Donald Trump. Let's take a look.
I hope you do well because our country needs it. And then we'll meet you in 3.5 years and see where we go next. That's part of the thing. What?
That there'll be another. Let's not get out over our skis, George.
Well, I don't.
You know, you play by the rules, but both sides have to believe that there should be rules. That's what I would say.
Yeah, there's some truth there.
Yes.
Well,
you know, they say if you're saving your country, you can commit no crime.
I heard that.
Yes.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
Wow, what a cool thing.
There's a personal backstory here in that Clooney's father, Nick, was a broadcast journalist who instilled values about the Fourth Estate in his son. On The Late Show, Clooney took a swipe at all 3 branches of government and said they're failing. He said the so-called Fourth Estate must fill the gaps.
Forever, we've had this issue, which is power kind of hates the Fourth Estate. They hate journalism. And my father's an anchorman and a newsman, and we've always believed in the idea of when the other 3 estates, the judiciary branch and the executive branch, and you know, when they all fail you, you really need that Fourth Estate, right? It has to be the people that can hold people to account. And this is one of those, this is a moment of us at our best. And I always like to show, and I like the idea of seeing ourselves at our best. I think that's always an exciting thing to do.
Clooney previously produced a movie about McCarthyism and about CBS legend Edward R. Murrow nearly 20 years ago. The adaptation of that movie will open on Broadway next month.
I saw that movie.
I saw that movie too, and normally I'm terrible in movies, but I actually did see that one. I thought it was good.
It was fine.
You thought it was too mainstream media loving, probably.
I mean, I saw it like 20 years ago,
I know, right?
So I don't think I had the same.
We were all younger men then,
views that I have now. Look, to George Clooney, or I guess it was more Steven Colbert's fear that we won't have an election, or Trump's going to cancel elections or something. I would say, nope, there will be an election in 4 years. This is not Ukraine, so we will have our election right on schedule. And
if we're invaded, we won't be having our election in defense of Mr. Zelenskyy.
Even if we were invaded, our elections just take place like that. Look, I thought George Clooney's attitude in this interview was perfectly fine. He's correct that you win some, you lose some, and you start organizing for next time. And Democrats were in the horrible position they were in, as we've discussed at great length, and even today, because Joe Biden decided to run for re-election anyway, and at some point along the way became not so necessarily capable of doing the job of presidency, or at least, and especially the job of running for president. And George Clooney took notice of that and did play a role, a significant role, in persuading him, or forcing him, really, that he had to drop out. So, I don't think anyone's going to really fault him for that, because even though Kamala Harris did lose, I still think Joe Biden would have lost even more devastatingly. So
you seem rather. I mean, you're being slightly nice to him, but you're a little.
I don't especially despise George. I mean, I obviously don't share his politics. I think he's a good actor. I like seeing him in movies.
Sure. Well, I thought that his comments on the Fourth Estate were actually important and useful, because I think we are at a time.
Well, I do hate other journalists, but
well, it's just at a time when the whole point of journalism is kind of under attack, and in all kinds of ways, both minor and major. We've been going through this rather ludicrous episode about the Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico, and the Associated Press being punished for their refusal to just adopt the administration's language. There are other bigger points. I mean, you, to your credit, made the argument that Politico was being wrongly kind of defamed by some of the reaction whenever the U.S.A.I.D. stuff was going on. In fact, people for whom information is important in their jobs were paying for subscriptions to a news organization's premier product. It wasn't a nefarious plot. So, all of these things, I think, contribute to an atmosphere in which the media is, for all its faults, and we talk about its faults quite a lot here, is in fact worth defending.
There are, sure, I agree with that. There are quite a lot of faults, and yes, some of the attacks on the media, not every lazy, going after media sort of criticism that every MAGA person makes is accurate or valid. As you point out, I pointed out with the Politico thing. Still, to compare Murrow, this legendary CBS journalist known for his efforts to expose McCarthy for not Kevin McCarthy, different McCarthy.
Different McCarthy. Earlier McCarthy.
Joseph McCarthy for making inconsistent claims about, or incorrect claims about pervasive communists in the government. That is fondly remembered correctly as speaking truth to power. I had a lot of criticisms for modern day CBS over the last few days. The interview with Marco Rubio that we discussed on Monday, that Margaret Brennan did, that I talked about it the last 2 days. You weren't here. I finally did watch the entire 60-minute segment where they interview those German prosecutors, and I don't think they really made themselves come. There was just not enough scrutiny of what there was almost a wistful the whole way through of like, wow, you're able to arrest people for doing these kinds of things, that I think sort of betrays the spirit of a Murrow. But
I didn't actually see or didn't interpret, I should say, the attitude of that 60-minute segment in the same way. I thought that the journalist in that instance was kind of delighted she was getting them to say what they were saying, because she understood there was a story in that, and therefore wanted them to continue in their rather unguarded way.
I was waiting for her to eventually say, and you get how crazy you sound, right? And that maybe that would have reassured me. Or maybe it's as you said, but I just didn't detect that at all.
To what extent are you concerned from your perspective about Trump's attacks on the media? Because they do seem to me serious. They do seem to me to be pretty noxious and to create a pretty unpleasant environment.
It depends what it is. I mean, Trump has the right to criticize the media. If it's attacks on the media, if it's just him saying failing New York Times, CNN ratings lower than ever, is that a productive use of his time? Whatever. But he has the right to do that, and I don't perceive that as an attack on the media. Now, some of the actions taken, like suing Jan Seltzer, is obviously ludicrous and should not happen, and I'm glad the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression is defending her. I don't want to have his Justice Department or his FCC organize investigations of media entities. Of course, I was also against Democrats doing the exact same thing as they have, as I've pointed out numerous times, threatening cable providers for platforming conservative news and media. I want my government to leave the media alone. And I think he should outsource more of his media criticism and commentary to just conservative media to do it.
Well, they'd be certainly eager to take up that baton.
Right, if the government, there's always a little bit of, if the government's doing it, it can be interpreted as a threat, even if it's just criticism. I've attacked Joe Biden an endless number of times for accusing Facebook of killing people. Now, it wasn't just that accusation. It then also was followed through on. And if they don't do more of the moderation I want, we're going to be changing the regulations that apply to social media companies. That was a threat that the White House Deputy Communications Director made. So I think it has to be more than just these people suck and I hate them.
Yeah, but I mean, when he's talking about using power to, for example, take away licenses and so on, that's obviously excessive and pretty autocratic use or threat to use power in all.
Yeah, I don't even want to attack licenses to do what? There should be no licensing, credentialing system for the media.
Yeah, but that's a separate argument from the fact that there is, and he wants to change it when he gets coverage he doesn't like. Yeah, that's obviously not undemocratic behavior.
Not for that at all. That does it for us today on Rising. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can find podcasts. See you later. Bye-bye.